Welcome to episode 52 of Engaging Franciscan Wisdom. My name is Sister Michelle Lallier, and I'm your host today. We've had a bit of a break with the episodes with the changing of the new year and my own community's recent elections and resulting transitions. Happily, we will continue to have the podcast, although the rhythm will be shifting as I ready to be part of the new leadership team for our community. So today, I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Dr. Patty Jimenez, for a conversation about culture and Franciscan spirituality. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you, Sister Michelle, for having me. So nice to be here.
Oh, thanks. I'm thrilled that you're here with us. It's a joy to have you on the podcast. You come to us from Southern California, which is a little warmer than up here in Minnesota right now. We both had some extreme weather, but we're both still here, so that's good news. You're ready to share your rich experiences and perspectives. And I'm remembering that we met through a mutual friend some 20 years or so, a little more perhaps, when you were living in an intentional community in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm grateful that during COVID, we reconnected again. As you know, I'm inspired by your life work and have always appreciated our conversations. So I want to say thank you for saying yes to being interviewed.
Thank you.
So let's begin. Patty, in your professional life, you've collaborated with the USCCB, which is a code for United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, and it's the Subcommittee on Hispanic Affairs as a consultant in communications for the fifth National Encuentro of Hispanic Ministry, and that's quite a mouthful. That's where we had
Yes, it is.
we had reconnected here in St. Cloud when you're up here doing an event. I was like, "Oh, Patty, it was wonderful."
Yes, I remember I was looking at my notes at something and I heard a voice. I know that voice. Michelle.
Yay! We ran to each other by the stage. It was a delightful reunion in person. Because since COVID, we've been meeting virtually. We're kind of across the country from each other. So thank God for technology. And thank God we can connect this way today. So you've ministered for over 27 years in the areas of youth ministry, catechesis, teaching, and administering lay formation programs. So that's also a whole nother mouthful, but that includes just so many relationships and so much building of the kingdom of God. So I want to thank you for that. In addition to being bilingual, you have experience in parish, academia, and diocesan ministry, as well as experience collaborating with many national Catholic organizations. You've received your doctorate in ministry, specializing in Hispanic Latino theology and ministry at Barry University in Miami, Florida. And on the other coast, you have a master's in theological studies and a master's in ministry for a multicultural church from the Franciscan School of Theology, which is really where we did get connected through relationships there at the time in Berkeley. So you're a Franciscan spiritual director and most recently the founder of Recetas, a community of US born or raised Latinas focusing on spirituality and self care. And we'll look forward in time to come to hear more about that. So, Patty, you bring this experience, you bring this skill to all that you do. And I'm looking forward to our conversation as we break that open. So, as noted, you come to us from Southern California. You have roots in and grew up also on both sides of the Mexico and US border. What was growing up like for you?
Well, I had a very transborder experience. Immigrated probably around 4.5, a couple months before I started kindergarten.
Mm,
So it was I remember a very scary experience for me because I didn't speak the language, having to
mm,
start in a new country and went to Catholic school and it was, Catholic school was my safe space too. I really, really loved it. I was able to pray every day and
mm,
have religion class. And what was unique about my transporter experience is that I prayed in English and went to mass in English in Catholic school. And then on the weekends, my mother would send us to Sunday school or faith formation programs in Spanish, and then we would go to mass in Spanish. So I was getting, I like to say I'm biliturgical because I'm able to move through liturgical experiences like mass or any sort of prayer experience in a Hispanic Latino context in Spanish, as well as a mainstream
Hmm.
English liturgy or prayer experience. So it was a very unique experience. I also would spend a lot of my summers, vacations, Holy Weeks in Mexico with my grandmothers. And I received a lot of my faith formation there too, even though I was getting it on a daily basis and then on weekends here in California. When I was in Mexico for to receive my sacraments, I still had to go to faith formation because I received my sacraments down in Mexico.
Wow.
My my godmothers were my tias, my aunts who lived there, and so my family wanted to celebrate the sacraments with the whole family, so I received them down there. So and I had Franciscans who also shaped me and prepared me for my confirmation. So yeah,
Mm. And those Franciscans were on either side of the border, or?
they were in Mexico, the ones that prepared me. My encounter with Franciscans on the U.S. side wasn't until I was in college. Yeah,
Mm. Isn't that fascinating?
yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, so
Wow.
I went on a retreat with Franciscans over here. I did an internship with Brother Ed Dunn, who was a Franciscan, on some immigration work here along the border. And yeah, so I was involved, and it was because of him that he said, I think you should study theology. He gave me a little business card that said Franciscan School of Theology, and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that this was something I could do. And he
Wow.
changed the direction of my life, and off I went to study.
Isn't that fascinating? So you had the roots. I remember you telling me once that the family, both sides of the border, really lived Franciscan values. And it was
Yes.
just the air you breathed. And it was later in college you kind of made these connections. So that's the
Well,
connection.
it actually wasn't until graduate school that I made the connection. I was studying up in Berkeley and I
Mm-hmm.
came home, might have been Thanksgiving or Christmas, and was having a conversation with my mother and my grandmother who were saying, oh, well, you do know that your grandmother or Abuelita Trini was a secular Franciscan.
Oh my gosh.
She's part of the Third Order. And actually, right here, I went to grab this earlier, but this is the rosary that she used to wear
Oh my.
on her habit. So as
Yeah.
part of her habit, and you can see it's really worn,
Well, Warren. Oh.
well worn and used. And the first time that I went to Assisi, I took it with me.
Mm.
And I remember touching the walls of, the tomb around Francis. There's
Yep.
these walls. And I remember touching the walls with this rosary. And I just felt my great grandmother's presence with me and knowing that she would have never been able to do this just
Mhm,
because of economics.
mhm.
And so, but I knew she was with me, and it was just a really beautiful, powerful experience to have her with me and have her rosary and to be in a CC. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what a beautiful story, crossing the generations, which is a part of certainly in, Hispanic culture.
Mhm.
The ancestors are so important and alive and vital, and for you to be able to bridge this alive and vital heritage that you inherited directly with your grandmother in Assisi is absolutely beautiful.
Yes. And
Wow.
then when I returned to school, and here I am, I'm reading Bonaventure, I'm reading Scotus, and reading Francis and Claire's writing. And I'm going, "Oh, this is, some of this stuff is pretty lofty."
Yes.
But when I broke it down to like the essentials of hospitality, of
Mhm,
care for creation, like if this is what my family lived every day, like especially the women in my family. And it was
mhm,
just really powerful to see that written theologically, to see that expressed.
mm,
Like, oh, yeah, this is us.
and, like, found a home in the bigger church that way.
Mhm.
Yeah. So what shape does being Franciscan take in your life at this time?
I believe that one is just a a huge reverence and connection with nature. I think
Mhm,
it's just where I feel very much God present. I also think in in my new projects, which I'll chat a little bit about in Recetas, I definitely have the values of which I think are very Franciscan. They may not be written in
mhm,
very overt ways. They're there and I can see them. And I think if Franciscans go in and look at them, they're like, oh yeah, that's very Franciscan. I think that's very much lived out in my everyday life. And yeah.
Mhm. Mm. It sounds to me a bit like a weaving
Hmm.
where you have certain threads that have been, they come from different places, but they've been woven, excuse me, woven together in a lovely pattern that is how you live your life in the 21st century as a person that's, fully bicultural. And I love what you said, bi liturgical, and how inspiring that is that it is possible because not everyone feels that sense of belonging or home. And
Yeah.
you, huh? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that, at some point I was looking at, should I become a secular Franciscan? But I don't feel these days that I need that.
Mhm. Mm.
Part of it is I feel like I'm Franciscan at heart, no matter if I'm part of it. What I feel is very institutionalized, where, Francis and Claire were not. They were a movement. And so I just, yeah, I think part of me feels okay with living out my values and Franciscanism without being part of sort of the institution of like a order, yeah.
Mhm. And we've maybe had some references to this along the way. Institutions are in a high state of transition right now globally, and certainly in the Americas. And so institutions that people have counted on are dissolving or reforming or deteriorating. And in their place are new initiatives and new happenings, of which Recetas is one. And the internet, it's one of its positive sides is that people can find each other who have espíritus afines, kindred
Mhm,
spirits.
mhm,
So that's again, well, we'll look forward, if not much in this interview, perhaps the next. You're breaking open further what that looks like of translating gospel treasure and riches and the Franciscan heritage to new generations, and
mhm.
particularly in the context of Latinas. So thank you for your capacity to experiment and your vision and creativity to manifest new forms that meet people exactly where they are, particularly new generations. So thank you.
It was interesting, I just got a message via Instagram, and this is a friend, was a very close friend from high school, and she was asking, for some recommendations. Easter is around the corner, and she was asking for some recommendations of something to do with her family, but she said, "I love what you're doing because you live in the real world and you give real world examples, but you're still very spiritual." And yeah, so I think she was looking for ways of connecting with especially younger generations, and how to celebrate Easter in a way that isn't so, I guess, churchy.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. The
Yeah.
embodiment of it in life. Yeah, bridging faith and life is one of the beautiful themes in the Franciscan family that we play with. What does it look like faith that's embodied? So I'm wondering, as we're kind of noting, are comfortable moving between cultures and particularly Latina, Hispanic, and US. What have you learned about navigating cultural traditions and spiritual practices when there's difference or conflict, even as you foster communication and communion in these diverse settings?
Yeah. I think the first one is to not make assumptions.
Mm.
I think it's really important to ask a lot of questions. I think oftentimes people just kind of jump in based on what is on the surface level, but they don't really know what's behind it. I can give you an example. Years ago, I was working with a Laotian tribe in Central California, and they were Catholic. And I kept hearing from uh, people in leadership were saying they don't care about vocations. This community doesn't care about vocations because they didn't have any priests and they didn't have any religious from their community. They had a deacon, but they just kept saying they don't care about vocations. And so an opportunity arose where I was invited with one of my staff members to go in and assist with a young adult retreat.
Mhm.
So we met with the young adult retreat leader and we said, "Well, what about vocations? Can we chat about vocations? Where does your community stand with vocation?" And so what we discovered was that in this particular community, you don't become an adult until you get married.
Mhm.
And you take on an adult name. They even give you a different name, an adult name. And so for them, if you don't get married, you don't become an adult.
Mhm.
And so for me, I was just like, my mind was blown. I was like, oh, wow. Like,
Yeah.
get the assumptions that were made that they don't care about vocations. But for them, you're talking about here's this like cultural significant moment of adulthood.
Mm.
And so, how do we then you know, how do we apply this to vocations? We know that there's a tradition within vocations of changing your name,
Mm.
taking on a new name. So how could we, so I soon chatted with, the higher ups and vocations folks about this, but I think it's really important to ask questions and
Mm.
rather than just assuming things. I've seen that happen over and over again in so many situations, or make assumptions about other people without taking consideration about what we are doing or not doing that is causing what's happening.
Yeah, the reflection about our contribution, just
Right.
another side of the assumptions. We have expectations and move out of them, but they sometimes aren't matched with the reality. Yeah. I appreciate also, Patty, that you are able to stay in curiosity and not judgment as you're moving about in that inquiry. And there's more likelihood that people will share if it's inquiry rather than judgment, is the
Mhm.
spirit of the conversation or resolving the differences or coming to mutual understanding. So good. Well, I'm wondering, do you have any favorite Franciscan stories or values that kind of speak to bridging differences or strengthening relationships in our world today?
I love the story of Francis and the Sultan.
Mm.
That's such a beautiful story of, here's a sultan who basically wants to kill all these Christians. And I think there was even like, oh, bring their heads to me or something along the lines of, I can't recall. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else, but I do remember that Francis shows up and greets him with peace in a very similar way that the Muslim tradition would do so, and is just they begin a conversation and begin to learn about each other. And Francis preaches, and he likes the way he preaches, and it really changes the Sultan in the way he treats the prisoners afterwards, the Christian prisoners. So yeah, I just think it's a beautiful encounter and beautiful moment, and certainly Franciscans and the Muslim tradition have a long history together. It's beautiful history. I
Mm.
even, even the history that from the Franciscan School of Theology, that when they moved there and sold the property there, it was taken over by the Muslim community to then start a school there. So I thought that was really a beautiful moment.
Beautiful. And to highlight one other element there that gets to the relationship piece, Francis also was changed by that encounter and how his prayer was changed and the gift he received of, I forget what it's called, the shofar or the call to prayer. It is a story of mutual engagement and transformation between the Sultan and Francis. While the war didn't end there was more to be worked through. It was a contributing factor. So,
Mhm.
yeah. Oh, that's a lovely story. Thank you.
I also really love the one of the wolf of Gubbio. We're talking about two different species, obviously, but there's, here's this wolf that's terrorizing the town, and Francis is like, go talk to this guy. I go chat with him. And was like, no, don't do it. He comes in, he'd been attacking livestock and then humans too. And he goes in and basically is like, hey, we're going to take care of you. We're going to take care of your needs and feed you. And it changes not just like the wolf's attitude of like, of violence towards the community, but it also changes the community where the community is then feeding this wolf. And it's just for me, it's a very beautiful message of like restorative justice.
Mm, mhm. And that restorative justice, to break that open for a moment. So the townspeople were terrified of and wanted to kill this wolf, this threat. And here's Francis coming back saying, no, you're going to welcome him in and feed him. The need for mutual conversion there. The wolf had to change its ways in trust that he would no longer have to fight to eat, but be fed, and the people trusting that this former predator would now live peaceably among them. And it happened. And it happened because Francis was a reliable witness or a person they could trust, or or I don't know that that step would have been taken. So the mediation, and that's a part of restorative justice. There has to be some process or way for the parties to meet each other and hear each other's needs and find a just way forward. So that's a great example. Yeah.
Yes, I really I think the underlying fear that is present, I think, I'm sure from both sides, I think there's just an underlying fear of
Yeah.
one, it's like I'm hungry and I'm
Mhm.
sure he's fighting to survive.
Mhm.
And the others are just completely afraid of the damage that this being is doing. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it speaks to the ability of people to grow. And when you deal with a lot of cross-cultural issues, oftentimes your folks aren't ready.
Mhm. Mhm.
But oftentimes it's as little as just stopping and listening to how people are feeling.
Yep. That builds a connection where before there might have been threat or
Yeah.
anxiety.
Just
Yeah.
feeling heard, it just shifts.
Yeah.
It causes a shift. Sometimes all people need
Mhm. Mhm.
is to be heard.
Mhm. Mhm. Have you ever heard of Catherine de Hook Doherty? She was a friend of Dorothy Day's, but ended up in Canada founding Madonna House and Friendship or Listening Houses. She's a kind of prolific author, Russian immigrant. And in one of her books, she quotes that we listen one another's souls into existence. And of course, it's not because the souls don't already exist, they do. But the awakening, the recognizing, the deep honoring of the soul activates something or awakens something. And I like that parallel in the spiritual life, the power of listening. So let's take that as a link here to the next question. You've worked in a variety of contexts, including spiritual director. So that's the little link here with listening. Community builder, founder of Outreach to Young Latina Women. You will return now in our next episode. We'll talk about that later as a guest host to share more of your outreach work with Latinas. But what can you tell us today about your kind of the vision that's been shaped out of the breadth of your own and depth of your own experience of bringing that into being? What would you like to say about that today?
Yeah, I think it takes into account all of my formation,
Mm.
which I consider primarily to be Franciscan. Even though I did study with Dominicans for my doctorate, they couldn't get the Franciscan out of me. I was always writing papers, including Franciscan theologians in there.
Uh, good.
Right. But I think it it brings together my theological and pastoral formation and all of the experience that I've had working in cross culture, but also with the Latino community. I've spent a great deal since 2014 just working with at the national level with Hispanic Latino ministry. And I think that for years I had been saying we really need to do something about, US born and raised. We need to do something about US. I just felt like I kept saying it and it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
And I had looked at old documents from the '80s with
Hmm.
Hispanic ministry where the people were bringing us forth that we needed to be doing something for US born and raised. And I just really didn't see it. I feel like a lot of Hispanic Latino ministry focuses on recent immigrants.
Mhm.
And then I was looking at the demographics of who was leaving the church,
Mhm.
and most of them were US born Latinos, and we just have a high percentage of those who are leaving the church or who maybe could still consider themselves Catholic, but don't participate or engage in the life of the church. I don't really like the term nominal Catholics, but
Yeah.
that's sort of the churchy language that we use.
Mhm.
But for me, I just was wondering, well, if we're not offering a space for them, then then why would they stay?
Yeah,
And
that's
so for
right.
me, that's sort of what gave me the impetus of moving forward, of creating a space for this.
Mm, mm,
And as someone who had also been very curious about different traditions and operating out of a very not only ecumenical but interfaith perspective of always I had friends who were Muslim, I had friends who were Buddhist Christians in college, and we just had these beautiful conversations and was introduced to meditation from an Indian Catholic priest when I was about 19. So I was doing meditation from a very young age, not knowing that we had something called centering prayer.
Mhm.
So for me, I was always exploring and I wanted a space to do that for for young Latinas to be able to do that.
Mhm. 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 So, what I'm hearing is part of the inspiration of the Spirit within you is to translate the wealth of the meditation capacity and the community capacity, the prayer capacity to in an accessible way for US born Latinas.
Yeah,
And that's a
how do we do vernacular theology, which is very
there we go.
Franciscan,
Yep.
in a digital space?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
How do we do that? How do we transfer that? And I'd been working a bit in communications, and so a lot of it is trial by error. We're just exploring and trying. Sometimes I feel like, "Oh, we can't be too Catholic," and then we try some Catholic stuff, and it does really well, and so it's just surprising to me, like,
Mhm.
what folks are drawn to, and it really depends because we have some folks who are not drawn to it at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Back in the day when I was working with young adult ministry, and I believe it's true in the circles of youth ministry, they you would use a term comprehensive youth or young adult ministry, and the sense being one size doesn't fit all. So we need to provide options that will meet different people in different places on their journey so that together, all of us has some window of or opening into the larger faith tradition. And I appreciate your experimenting with that is precisely doing that. Yeah.
And I think that also adding the focus of self-care where we look at
Mhm.
7 other what is it? A total of 7 areas of wellness, I think broadens it and attracts other folks who are then looking, "Oh, yeah, spiritual wellness is something that I need to take a look at as well." And one of the things that I've noticed as a spiritual director is that if any other area of their life in those other 6 areas is off, it's hard to really focus on the spiritual because all of this is kind of taking over, either the mental piece or the emotional, which are all part of the work that we do in spiritual direction. But we know it's a very integrated process, but if sometimes it can feel as if you're moving into like I'm not a therapist, I'm a spiritual director. And so
Mhm.
you have to help folks direct them towards, hey, take care of this wellness piece so that we can do the work here.
Right, right. Yeah, that's beautiful. Perhaps in the show notes, we can put a couple connections to, what would you say, stimulate the appetite for listening in on the next podcast. 'Cause I think breaking that open would be very rich. Yeah, thank you. So, as we come to a close here, what wisdom would you offer to those that are hungry, might be for belonging, for something more, for community in their lives?
I'm trying to find this. There was this quote that I read and I couldn't find it, but maybe we can add it in later. But the premise of it is says that we all belong.
Mm,
We all belong. And if we've ever felt that we didn't, it's usually because we haven't been adequately provided for or
mhm,
cared for. And so that has resonated for me as a Latina and that's been raised here in the United States. And so I take a huge responsibility now of how do I create belonging for US born and raised Latinas. And so at times we have to, if we feel like, hey, I don't belong, maybe it's the spirit that's moving us to create spaces of belonging for others.
mhm, mhm. There is something paradoxical about that, that we can feel we don't belong, and yet by using our own agency or capacity to choose, we can collaborate in finding where we belong, which takes initiative and some sense of risk, especially if we're introverted or, we culturally feel out of place or whatever. So having an environment, digital space that you're offering for Ready Set This, for these kinds of encounters to strengthen our at homeness, perhaps will help people in the rest of their daily lives to also feel more at home.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your life, for your faith, for the beauty of how you integrate experience in the world of the spirit. And maybe you could, as we close, just say a few more words of what is vernacular theologian. It's probably not a familiar pairing of words, and yet it's something we speak about for Saint Francis and how he was in the world.
Yeah, it's just like how do you translate really lofty theological terms or teachings into everyday terms so that anyone can understand it? And so for me, it's translated in what we Latino theologians or pastoral ministers speak of la vida cotidiana, our everyday life.
Hmm.
And so how do we integrate it and speak in a language that is accessible to most people nowadays? So I can give you one example. We put out affirmations in on our social media, and so some folks are like, well, this is kind of silly stuff, where you're sort of affirming yourself. And I think it's a very sort of Franciscan thing to see the goodness and the beauty of the self. It's a very incarnational things. And they're very popular.
Hmm.
And we constantly get messages from people saying, I really needed this today. And
Hmm.
a lot of it is just about loving self.
Hmm.
And I always find, you know, Jesus' statement of love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't say love your neighbor more than yourself. And so I think it's been really beautiful to see how we can take something as simple as, any statement of teaching and then apply it to something that's very popular in culture,
Hmm.
uh, without it being particularly churchy, but
Right.
it's still teaching our values of loving yourself and caring for yourself.
Yeah. So thank you for your translation skills to be able to do that. You're among others that are about the same work, but you have your particular sweet spot of your own heart and values meeting the needs of the world, you might say. So,
And I have a great team that's very creative in doing this, of young Latinas who are excited to be able to figure out how to do this.
yep. And just a segue with that, one of your team is one of our former Franciscan community volunteers, Stephanie Luna. And Luna was interviewed maybe a year and a half ago on the podcast. So if people want to tune into the kind of enthusiasm of her life journey, and I know with you, she's found a bit of a place to give expression to that work of the spirit that is her life. So I'll look forward to meeting through the podcast more people on your team as well. That'll be lovely.
Definitely. We're
So,
excited to do that.
yep, good. So I want to again thank you for being on the podcast today, for sharing your experience of building community, for your service, your leadership in church and world, and how you've enriched this little conversation about culture and Franciscan spirituality. You've given us a lot to pause, to consider, and we do look forward to the next podcast where you will be the guest host and we'll learn more about Franciscan values and practice that inspire recetas, again in service to US born Latinas. So may God bless you in your continued journey. And once again, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, lovely. So, our listeners, thank you for being here, and may peace and all good be yours. Bye now.
Paz y bien.
Paz y bien.